Hello everybody, today I'm going to talk about the Committee on Geologically Defining a Continent 2021. This is when it was formed. This is when the definitions were finalized. So a year and 2 weeks later. I am doing this for you because some of you asked me to do something. Our findings, our results on defining a continent for earth science purposes is in a published book. The reason for that is for records, so people have something to track it down, so it just doesn't fade into the background and obscurity of nothingness if websites get deactivated and stuff like this. That means you have to purchase it. I am not a fan of having to purchase knowledge. However, I just stated why we did that. Plus, this isn't the only thing in that volume. It's the Midwest Institute of Geosciences and Engineering. And we put these publications out every so often. There's no set schedule. It's in the most recent one. I'll link it. And it's about 30 bucks, I think. And this is only 15 pages. And you might be like, Steve, 30 bucks for 15 pages. That's a lot of money. Well, like I said, it's the current workings of the Institute. It's about 100 pages plus or minus this book. So there's other things in there. And for those of you who have ever had the pain of having to purchase a scientific article, 15 pages for $2 a page is a bargain. Plus, it helps the Institute out a little bit too, and we can keep doing scientific things. I can keep doing scientific things. So this is just basically the whole thing here. I will be showing you a couple of pages here. I will not be going over this entire thing verbatim because that would violate the copyrights. It's something I just thought weird. How could stuff you've helped form be plagiarized by you? Anyway, talks for other times. But the committee was formed on that date, and I'll get into what prompted that later. But just so you know, there is a list of contributors, okay? List of contributors and a timeline of events. So there's just some sort of record there. As you can see, there are 11 basic criteria for a continent. I'll come back to this. Don't let it distract you. It just took me forever to draw as sloppily as it is. There is an abstract and an introduction, so it is formulated like a paper. It wasn't published in a journal because these type of things usually only get published in journals that the journal is responsible for their publication. So to avoid arguing and stuff like that, just a bunch of us professionally decided to get together and do this, and we are all, qualified to do this. All right, this isn't. We just didn't pull a couple dozen people from the street and form this committee. That's not what happened. Without further ado, let me get into the meat of this for you. Criteria number 1 is based off the generic definition of a continent. We did this for a starting point. And the reason this was done is because we didn't want to go into this kicking down doors, punching through windows, knocking books off of shelves, saying it's going to be our way, your concept's invalid, this is how it is. We're trying to avoid that because if you do that, no one will use it. And that's just how people are. And I can understand that. And just like I know a lot of you are upset with what happened in 2006, the whole Pluto thing. But quite honestly, those people, and a lot of them got together and said, we are going to do this. We need to do this so we can study these things. Public will have their opinion, but it doesn't matter. Why? Because we can all have opinions on anything and everything, but if you don't look through that telescope at the night sky, if you don't spend weeks and hours meticulously taking notes, photographs, looking for stuff moving across the sky, writing lengthy papers, listening for bizarre sounds, and all that other stuff, you don't know what it's like. They felt they needed to do it, so they did it. You can argue about Pluto being a planet till your head falls off in the public forum, but it doesn't matter. All right. And people who wrangle about months and years about definitions should have been happy for that because they got what they asked for. And you guys know I get pretty upset about people who argue definitions and waste time, because that is a waste of time. So there is a method to this madness, but like I said, we can't just go bulldozing through everything. So number one is a physically continuous landmass with a surface above sea level, including the continental shelf. That's basically this. This is my plan map view of North America. And this is the continental shelf. And you may be like, well, yeah, but Hudson Bay's over here, and you're right. And it looks more like something like this-ish, comes down, yeah, whatever. I know this is not exact, but you get my drift. So it doesn't just include the stuff above sea level. It includes that continental shelf. And continental shelf is one of the things we defined later, so we can talk about this. What a continent is the biggest, lengthiest part of this. It is not the only thing we defined. We had to define other things so we could talk about this, but we didn't want to go down rabbit holes. We weren't going to define every single word. Like, I'm not going to define for you what a landmass is. I think you have enough common sense to figure that one out for yourself. Okay, that's not what our intent here was. We only defined other things, and pretty vaguely in some cases, so we could construct this concept, this definition. This definition was our goal. This, not a bunch of rabbit holes and arbitrary words and stuff like that. This one's going to sound odd to you, and I'll come back as to why this is. Number two, based off number one, that entire surface area must be greater than 1 million kilometers squared in area. Why is that? We'll come back to it. Number three, outer natural boundaries are where the shelf meets the ocean floor, or the continental crust meets the ocean crust. The edge of the continental shelf, okay? Number four, a continent itself is surrounded by at least 80% ocean crust. And we argued about this number for a while, and it was decided 80. 90 was too much, 70 was too low, it's too close to 2/3. We wanted something that would kind of make continents discernible beyond question, because as you know, there are some continents whose continental shelves connect, but the stuff above sea level does not. The Eurasian continent and the North American continent. So, and we explain this, the reason why this is so long is because we go through the official definition of North America. Was going to do all the continents, but we'd have been here for another 3 years. And so this essentially is the line. North America, Eurasia. And as long as they don't connect by more than 20%, that's legal, if you will, okay? You can do that. And they don't. That's not more than 20%. However, it did something else. This old guy right here, some of you may realize that's Greenland. Well, you got another continent, guys. We tried. We just couldn't do it. And there's other reasons why we couldn't get Greenland in with North America. So the boundary's something like kind of like that. It's well defined and well described within the literature, within what we wrote. But Greenland's its own continent. We just couldn't justify the square peg into the round hole, okay? It just felt like if we started doing that and we started saying, well, we just want to have 6 continents because those are the ones everyone's familiar with, or 7, depending on who you ask, we're going to open Pandora's boxes. And we didn't want to do that. So you have 7 continents, and I'll touch on what they are at the end. Continents are composed of mostly felsic and intermediate rocks, dominantly, so more than half. So things like Hawaiian Islands aren't even a contender at this point, nor are any other volcanic islands, even if they have minor felsic components. and are more than 1 million kilometers squared in area. Takes those out. Now this part's key, and it's further down the list just because it was the order in which we did things. But a continent must have at least one Archean craton. And we actually do define a craton within here. Different people define craton differently. There are no Phanerozoic cratons at all. So New Zealand has no chance of being a continent in and of itself. So you don't have a craton, you can't even be considered to be a continent. It has to be Archean, because some people say there's Neoproterozoic cratons and others say there aren't. So we just made sure it had to do with cores of continents. Now here's the thing. This is why that 1 million kilometers squared thing was thrown in there. Because if we didn't toss that in there, that would have made Madagascar a continent. It has an Archean craton. Not a complete one, but it does have one. And I don't think anyone could argue Madagascar is a continent. It's a continental fragment, and we do define that here as well. And that's fine, but we felt that that was not unreasonable to make that 1 million kilometers squared standard. That was probably the most obscure thing we did to fit the square peg into the round hole. Now, like I said, we also ended up with one more continent here, and we didn't want to just keep defining things, saying if it's above this latitude, the continent has to be this much, in land area, if it's below, it has to be less than this much, because then you can't extrapolate these things into the past. And that's what we want to do, because geology is not just today. It's not just 65 million years ago. It's not just 300 million years ago. It's 4.5 billion years. And we are defining this for the purposes of Earth. That's another thing too I forgot to mention. It's in the introduction, I think, somewhere. It's in there somewhere. I already mentioned this. A continent cannot have more than 20% of its continental shelf in contact with another continent. So, if we arbitrarily wanted to, we could say this is one continent, but this is not more than 20%. Even when you put this into there, it's not more than 20%. And this, North America, is its own continent. And like I said, we physically define the boundaries of the North American continent in this. So you can't sit there and start trying to say, well, maybe Eurasia is part of North America. We axed that. Now, we didn't do everything, like I said, because we didn't want to be here for 3 more years. But what that also did was it made Greenland a continent. Because there is ocean crust. What are the exact numbers? I've got them here. The calculations are in here. I've tried several different methods, different measuring techniques. And I think the most we came up with was 16%. So that 20% was not achieved. So it is its own continent. This is going to be better if I show you. This is a cross-sectional view, not to scale. This is your continental surface. We'll say this is your continental shelf. It comes down, and then it hits your oceanic crust, which is mafic. This is felsic, so it's to intermediate. Just put felsic there because I won't be here forever. And this is mostly mafic, some places ultramafic. So your border laterally has already been defined. That border is right here. But how far down does that extend? When we can't extend it down to the center of the Earth, that doesn't make sense from a geologic standpoint. It's not practical. The mantle works independently of the lithosphere. So we need to set a shallower boundary. So we decided to take it down to the base of the crust, your moho. That is the border. Now, this is the geophysical moho we're using, not the physical, because until we drill down, even though we have ophiolites, until we drill down and hit that moho, we really don't know its physical nature. So we did the geophysical border, which is fine. Now there is a kind of little bit added in there to include the entire lithosphere if you feel it's appropriate, but no deeper than that. And the reason why that little blurb is in there, and it's not just the MOHO, is because sometimes plates will go under one another and we don't want to include those. So depending on this, you could include the lithosphere if you wanted to. And another reason why that was included was because a lot of continents under the cratons have keels, and we wanted to include those as well. So when talking about interior tectonics, you could use that definition to describe the lithosphere too. And why do we even care? Because the mantle lithosphere and the crustal lithosphere function together as one rigid unit in plate tectonics. Yeah, it's broken into plates, but the mantle lithosphere gets subducted into the asthenosphere just like the crust does. So that's why that is in there. Number 9, and this is what started this whole thing. Continental boundaries are independent of the things human beings do and human concepts not bound by physical objects. What do I mean by that? It's independent of socioeconomics, geopolitical, historical, and cultural constraints. You might be like, but Steve, that sounds bigoted. It is not. The human race, human species has been around, what, 100,000 years? How old's the Earth? 4.5 billion years. The Earth has a little more on us, okay? We're a blip. So we're excluding the things humans do. And this is what actually started the whole thing, because social media had a positive impact for once. I can't believe this. And I think it was Twitter on top of it. I was talking about continents and geology, and some guy interjects himself in there and goes, well, Central America's a continent. And everyone in the feed is like, huh? What? And I guess from a socioeconomic standpoint, and I don't know the reason for that, but I have a strong suspicion the reason for that, because I do it too as a human being. I am a scientist, but I am also a fallible human being. And I want my part of the world to be special, just like you do and your neighbor does. And by sitting there and assigning it a big name or a big fragment of something to it, it makes it sound larger than it is. And whatever. I'm not going to argue with that. In that atmosphere, in that world, call it whatever you want. But don't say Central America is a continent when talking to a bunch of earth scientists. All right, something else too. It includes all the rivers, lakes, and stuff like that. You have Hudson Bay. That's part of North America, the edge of the continental shelf. You have the Great Lakes here. Those are part of the North American continent. You have the Mississippi River, etc. Why did we put that in there? And it's actually a pretty good suggestion, because somebody somewhere would be like, well, if the continents, if water helps define the boundaries of a continent, which it doesn't, it's actually this. It just happens that the oceans are there. Oops, you can't even see that. The oceans are there and people like water boundaries. To avoid that, we added that, because no river, no lake, I don't care how big it is, including Lake Gitchagumi, and my favorite, it does not go beneath that continent. It barely scratches the surface of it. So we just added that to just kind of be like, hey, yes, these things, if they're on the continents, they're part of the continents. So we just thought that distinction was necessary. Number 11, this is the last one, emergent island chains. If an island chain, and some of them have shelves, but they're not continental shelves. Sometimes an island chain can form by back arc extension and rift away from a continent. That happens, so it's separate, but if it's still attached by 5%, I think it's 5%, I'm sorry, by 5% to a larger continent, they could be considered part of that continent, like the Japanese islands. Madagascar is not part of Africa in this definition because the shelves are not physically connected. So Japan is part of Asia. Madagascar is not part of Africa. Hawaii is not part of North America. Why is that, Steve? Well, Why not just sit there and assign them to these things? From a political standpoint, yes, Hawaii is part of the United States. We consider it part of North America. No one argues that. Not the point. Because when you go back in time and you start doing continental reconstructions, these island chains, unless they've merged themselves and are accreted to a continent, they're gone. They're nowhere in the geologic record, especially mafic volcanic ones. They've been recycled into the mantle. You're not even aware they were here ever. Okay? So they're excluded. All right? Just from a continent. Yes, they're islands. They're island arcs. All that other stuff, that's fine, but they are not parts of continents unless at least 5% of that shelf is connected to a larger continent. All right, so let's get into some of the other things we had to redefine out of necessity. You know, we did this as a side effect of defining a continent, but we limited our scope, we limited our definitions in order to avoid rabbit holes. So we did define what continental crust was. Continental fragment, basically I told you Madagascar is one. A craton, which is the longest one of these. And there are certain papers in here that are standards we use for this, and we cite those papers. So it's not like we have no basis of reference for this, all right? We have a new term in there called megacontinent, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Paleocontinent, basically that's a continent that no longer exists or has formed a larger continent like Laurentia, Gondwana, Kennerland, parts of Colombia, Nuna, whatever. Those can be referred to as paleocontinents or even protocontinents like Laurentia. We don't care, whatever, it's fine. They weren't the main focus of this, but we felt that it was necessary to define that. You have a pseudocontinent. Why was that put in there? Well, it's because you have heard the 11 criteria for continent. And some of you may be wondering, and some of you may be being held in suspense here, but I doubt it. That's just me. Some of you may be like, Steve, what about Zealandia? Well, these 11 criteria acts that. There's no cratons. There's no continental shelf. The majority of it isn't above water, isn't above sea level. It's not a continent. The reason why Zealandia was given continental status in a paper was to grab attention. Geologists, we are people too. People usually are remembered more for the terms that they interject into the scientific community than they are for their actual work. And a lot of people thrive off this. They're always looking for that new buzzword, dark matter, supercontinent, whatever that might be. Not most of us. Most of us don't care. And I'm not saying that's why those guys were doing exactly that. But it was an attempt to grab headlines. And we as scientists have started doing that in the past 20 years, and we need to cut that crap out. Zealandia is by no way measure a continent. It's done. The purpose of this definition wasn't to eliminate it as a continent, but you can't fit that square peg into the round hole at all. It's not even a square peg. It's more like a diamond wrapped in a rectangular peg, trying to jam that into a round hole. It's just so obscure, so unfamiliar, so random. A bunch of felsic parts on the ocean crust shouldn't make a continent. So we had to put pseudocontinent in here, and Zealandia would be a pseudocontinent. It's a continent that can't, couldn't get up that hill, for whatever reason. Defined as shield, I've talked about this before. Shields, cratons have traditionally been used interchangeable in the past, and do a little bit of refinement there. Subcontinent would be something like India. It was technically its own continent at one point, but has been accreted through tectonics to a larger continent. North America may become a part of Eurasia someday. I don't think it will. If Wilson cycles have taught us anything, the Atlantic Ocean will close. It will not keep expanding. But, I don't have a crystal ball either. And continents can become other continents through time, not be parts, all that stuff. We didn't restrict any of that. Then we have a supercontinent. And this is the reason why we have megacontinent now. We decided a supercontinent is where all these continental shelves, if more than 75% of these connect. Then you have a supercontinent, Pangaea, Rodinia, Columbia/Nuna, those type of things. That's a supercontinent. Golgonda is not a supercontinent. It's a megacontinent. Eurasia could be argued, does that fall under megacontinent? I look at the exact definition. Sorry, I should have elaborated there. Oh, it's when at least 40%. So I did do a quick math on that. I think that does exclude Eurasia. Eurasia's close, but not quite. But someone else can delineate that for sure later. And if it is over 40%, then we have a megacontinent on Earth now. If not, so be it. We defined it at 40%. So megacontinent was stuck in there too. And the reason for that was because when we go deep into the past, and some of you may be familiar with like the supercontinent Kennerland 2.5 billion years ago, late Archean, early Paleoproterozoic. Well, we aren't even sure if this thing was one continent, two continents, or three. We don't know. So megacontinent is more appropriate for that kind of uncertainty. So that's why this is in there. We'll wrap this up here soon. But before I give you the list of Earth's present continents, and I think this is a good balance. I think we came up with something really well. We have something that's familiar, although a couple of things got sacrificed, some things got added, but at least that basic familiarity has not been lost. Just like with the definition of a planet, some things had to be given, some things were gained. That's how these things go, all right? So I think this was a good way to do this. I am going to read the conclusion for you. All right, and I got to take these off because I'm old. Conclusions. The definitions herein have been standardized for continent and related terms. These definitions provide a well-defined concept and framework for future works involving the usages of the words defined herein. Don't worry, it's only like one more sentence. We understand that extrapolating definitions into the deep past may be a bit cumbersome, but we do not feel that it is necessarily impossible to do so. So that's our conclusion. So just a few sentences, nothing more. And the result of that is, here are your 7 continents: Africa, Antarctica, Australia, Eurasia, Greenland, North America, South America. Now, some of you guys may be like, well, Greenland isn't 50% above sea level for the continental crust. But like I said, lakes, actually, I think glaciers is actually physically listed in here. Lakes, rivers, glaciers, stuff like that count as part of the continents they sit upon. From an earth science standpoint, in the planet Earth, welcome to your 7 modern continents. And like I said, if you want to purchase this, go ahead and do so. Maybe several years down the line, I'll unlock it. I said it is on ResearchGate, but it's just for the view of me and the people involved in this that are on there. They can look at it, I can look at it. So until that day comes, until this gets out there a little bit, it's going to still be purchasable. And I do apologize for that, but I also wanted to give you guys something. I also wanted to explain this to you. I also wanted to give you the framework for this so you wouldn't be left hanging and be like, Steve, I heard you did this with a bunch of people, but where's the results? Well, this is them. Anyway, that's it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I hope this was helpful.